for our second session in the Social Impact Showcase series. Throughout the series, we're going to be highlighting the meaningful work that our clinics have been doing for over 50 years now. We've been serving our neighborhood here in Washington, D.C. and beyond, and the clinic officially launched in 1971, but in light of the pandemic and just our wishes to properly honor the clinics and this exciting milestone, we are extending our 50th year and continuing to celebrate so that we can reconnect with alums and properly honor the clinics. There's really so much to celebrate during this time. Again, unprecedented growth this year. The clinics, thanks to the support of our outstanding law school dean, Dana Matthew, and our DAR office, we have raised $3 million, which really puts us in a good position to be able to meet our goals with the hope of allowing the opportunity for clinic participation to all students who want to participate. We also have provided over 72,000 hours of pro bono legal services just this year, which is another record. And very importantly, we've expanded to 16 legal clinics, and they all cover different practice areas. 5 of those clinics have been established just in the past several months. And while we aren't able to honor each of our clinics during the showcase series, we do honor them frequently in our clinic newsletter. So we also encourage you to take a look at those. They come out periodically. And we also have a very active LinkedIn account as well as other social media platforms where we get the information out in real time. The series really is intended to highlight 50 years of excellence in clinical teaching, client representation, alumni partnerships, and professional development, which really has all been the hallmark of the clinics since the start. Our clinics have spent the last 50 years empowering change agents, training social impact lawyers, molding practice-ready attorneys, inspiring professional identity formation, and advocating for justice worldwide. Just this year, the clinic has served 220 amazing clients, and we have the privilege of having one of those clients joining us this evening. During tonight's session, we'll get his perspectives as well as the perspectives of his legal counsel. And our immigration clinic has the motto, saving lives and reuniting families, and you will hear exactly why this evening. Before we kick off the panel discussion, which is really the main event, just a few housekeeping items up front. We do have an open audience Q&A towards the end of the session, and so folks who have questions, feel free to raise your hands, and we will get you the microphone at that time. And for our folks on Zoom, feel free to include your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them as they come. And one other thing, if you could leave your masks on unless you're actively eating or drinking or speaking to our panelists, that would be wonderful. And with that, I will turn it over to Professorial Lecturer in Law, Paulina Vera, who is one of our 2 incredible professors in our immigration clinic.
So thank you so much for that introduction. Before we get to the real stars of today's show, which are Eric and Sadra, I am going to tell you all a little bit about myself and a little bit more about the immigration clinic. I am Professor Paulina Vera. I am actually a proud double GW alumna, undergrad and law school. And I'm an alum of the immigration clinic where I spent 2 semesters my 3rd year of law school, including working with Eric right here, which we'll get to momentarily, when I was a student attorney. So I am the proud daughter of 2 immigrants from 2 very different places who had 2 very different paths to the United States. My mom is from England, and my dad, rest in peace, was from Peru. I also grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and so immigration has been a very personal issue for me my entire life. I actually went to law school wanting to pursue immigration law, and I was very interested in going to GW Law because of the reputation of the immigration clinic. And that's thanks to Professor Benitez, who is the director of the clinic. The immigration clinic has been around since 1979, but since 1996, Professor Benitez has been the director of the clinic, and he was actually one of my supervisors when I was a 3rd year law student. I worked for some time in an immigration nonprofit after I went to law school. However, I came back in February of 2017 because I was really passionate about clinical education. I was the only immigration staff attorney at a rather large immigrant rights nonprofit called CASA. For a time, I had no supervisor. And so I really had to rely on my experiences in the immigration clinic to navigate the complexities of immigration law. When I was a student in the immigration clinic, I was able to do an asylum hearing for a domestic violence survivor, and we ultimately got her asylum, and we're able to bring her daughter over here as well from Central America. I got to work on a green card application with Eric right here. I also got to do a citizenship application. So it was a lot of hands-on practical experience that, again, I was able to take into my first legal job. And so I came back in 2017 to continue to do that good work on a pro bono basis, and also to be able to work with law students, right, and really to train the next generation of public interest attorneys, many of whom do go on to have careers in immigration law. So a little bit more about the immigration clinic specifically. We handle all types of cases, and from all over the world, really. We have clients from over 20 countries that are represented that speak all sorts of languages, and we're able to offer them legal representation, again, on a pro bono basis, in a really well-resourced manner. For example, we have access to interpreters, translators, FedEx, putting together all the good things for the filings, none of which cost the clients anything. We handle primarily family-based cases, so we'll talk momentarily. For example, Eric's wife, we are also helping out with her process, and so that's a family-based process. And we do a lot of humanitarian forms of relief. So things like U visas, which are for victims of crimes here in the United States, T visas for trafficking victims, DACA, which you may probably have heard of in the news, VAWA, so violence against women, and TPS, temporary protected status. The bulk of what we do, though, are asylum cases. And so there are different forums in which a person can present their asylum case. They can either go to the asylum office, which we have here in Virginia, right off the Roslyn Metro, or they can go to the various immigration courts. And we primarily practice in the Arlington Immigration Court, although one new immigration court just opened and another one's about to open, so we'll probably be going there as well. So we're definitely very busy. One such asylum case, again, was Eric's. And so we'll, with that, I will actually start asking the questions, again, of the real stars of the show, starting with you, Eric. So the first question I have for you is if you could please describe your journey to the United States and just generally what your experience has been like in the U.S. immigration system.
Well, thank you. So I came in the United States in 2008. I joined the immigration clinic in spring of 2009, I believe. So that was an extremely long process because the clinic helped me get my asylum approved by the immigration judge in 2010. And overall, personally, it has been a really long process because it took, I would say, about 6 years for me to have my green card after being approved for asylum. And personally, it did affect my professional life in some point because I couldn't apply. I mean, I was able to apply for a couple of jobs, but because of my immigration status at the time, because I only had a working permit that was a 1-year working permit at the time. So I've dealt with a lot of rejections from employers because they didn't want to hire someone that had a working permit that was about to expire when I was, applying for jobs.
Great. And so if you could just tell us a little bit more, in your journey, right, navigating through the immigration system, you worked with us, and
Right.
you, as you stated, you've been a longtime client, over a decade at this point.
Right.
So what was your experience like working with not only the immigration clinic, myself, Professor Benitez, but all the numerous student attorneys, right, some of whom are joining us today via Zoom?
The experience was great. I worked with excellent student attorneys, and I wanted to thank all the professors, Professor Benitez, Professor Vera, and I believe Professor Williams. At the time, they really helped me a lot. My journey was quite long, like I said. It took me like years to finally get my green card. But the thing I really appreciate the most were I was really prepared for my different trials. I know we had a couple of rehearsals, so I was really prepared. My case was granted by the immigration judge, but unfortunately, the government attorney decided to appeal, so it took another 4 years for me to have another trial. So, but the work from the clinic was great. I had great student attorney all the way.
Great. Well, I promise I didn't pay him to say that. So thank you, Eric, for your kind words. So I guess going off a little bit about going to court, because you had to go to immigration court several times.
Right.
What was that like for you? As someone who was trying to get protection to stay in the United States and be safe here in the United States, right? What did it feel like walking into that courtroom, seeing the judge, seeing the trial attorney? Maybe you could just explain that for folks who haven't seen immigration court before.
Well, for me, it was extremely stressful to deal with the immigration judge because the only thing I was thinking about was I could be deported. So I was extremely nervous to deal with the different, the judges, the government attorney that was extremely, mean to me. I mean, she was playing her role, but overall, it was a very stressful experience for me, I would say that. But thanks to the immigration clinic, I was well prepared because we did a couple of rehearsals. So I was really prepared for all the potential questions I could have regarding my case.
Great. So you mentioned some things, the mean trial attorney, things like that, but were there other things throughout your experience that really surprised you about the immigration process?
I would say the whole process is random. Like it's like playing the lottery because I still today I don't understand why my case took so long. And even for me having my citizenship. So from the day I had the interview for my citizenship to the oath ceremony, it took almost 2 years, and they didn't ask for any evidence. They didn't ask for anything. It was just me waiting. I couldn't talk to anyone, and it was extremely frustrating.
What did it feel like the moment that you found out that you finally got your citizenship, and then when you got to go to your swearing in?
Oh, it was a great joy, great satisfaction, and thanks again to the clinic. That's all I can say.
I will say I was there rooting him on in the parking lot because I was not allowed in the actual building for his swearing in, but it was very exciting to celebrate afterwards. So before we kick it over to Sadra for some of his thoughts, what advice, Eric, would you give to other folks like yourself, right, that are fleeing persecution in their country, coming to the United States, and wanting to navigate this immigration process?
Well, the first thing, you have to be extremely patient because you don't know what the outcome's gonna be. Because I've never imagined that my case would take so long. So, rule number one, you have to be extremely patient. Extremely patient. That's all I can say. I learned to be patient.
Well, thank you, Eric, for sharing your experiences with us and for sharing that advice. I definitely can echo that. Unfortunately, our system, anything from asking for a work permit to getting the green card, takes a tremendous amount of time with the current situation for processing applications. So next, we're going to turn to one of the various student attorneys that you worked with, including myself. And so, Sadra, before we start talking about what that looked like from a student perspective, please go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you for the chance. I'm Mir Sadran Abavi. I'm LLM student at GW, Litigation and Dispute Resolution. I'm Georgetown Law alum, LLM again. And I'm happy to be here. I had the wonderful chance to work at the GW Immigration Clinic. Thanks to Professor Vera and Professor Benitez. And thank you for having me.
Great. So Sadra, so Eric just told us, right, about what his experience was like as a client, but could you describe for us what your experience was like working with Eric who, if I'm not mistaken, was one of your first immigration clients ever.
Sure, it was my, I mean, Eric and Isabel were my first clients, and I think they were the best first client an LL student could ever had for his first case, basically, because they were very responsive, very cooperative. They complied with all of the deadlines I set for them. And Eric even sometimes did his own legal research and came up with some legal initiatives, which is a good thing for clients to know and understand what's going on in his case. Overall, it was a great experience working with them.
So Sadra, could you explain to us what you mean by he met all his deadlines and he got you all the things that you asked for? For someone who maybe is thinking about doing a clinic or the immigration clinic, right? Could you just walk us through what that looks like, what the day-to-day looks like as a student attorney?
Sure. As you probably know, immigration law and like any other area of law, but I would say immigration specifically, dates are really important. Deadlines are really important. You can basically lose your case if you miss a deadline. So as a student attorney, professors set some deadlines for you to come up with your drafts for whatever you're working on. And you yourself, you have to set another deadlines for your basically internal deadlines for your clients to come up with, and also set another internal deadlines for yourself to make sure that you're gonna comply with the main deadline in the case. So deadlines and dates are really important, and providing evidence and providing other information on time is, I think, the most important thing in immigration law.
Great. So speaking of immigration law, just generally, what were some things that surprised you while going through this process, whether it be with Eric or just any of the cases that you worked on in the clinic?
Sure. Actually, before I work at the clinic, I knew that it takes so long for the cases to be processed and granted. As you heard from Eric, there are lots of, like, especially asylum cases, which have been 7 years in backlog, which puts the clients in uncertainty and also in distress. They cannot find a job. They cannot. They are always stressed. I myself, I'm an immigrant, so that's my lived experience too, kind of, as a student. And that was the most surprising thing I confronted with in the clinic.
Thank you, Sadra. So similar to Eric, right? What advice would you give to other law students who are wanting to work in a clinic generally or who are wanting to work specifically in the immigration clinic?
Sure. I would say, first of all, enjoy your time at the clinic because you're going to meet wonderful people like Professor Vera, Professor Benitez, and also colleagues, which you are going to make friends. And also, you're going to learn lots of things from them. Just think about that you're saving lives with the job you do, or unite families with the job you're doing. So I think that's the wonderful feeling at the result or at the end of any case that you can have, that satisfaction. And for those students who are who doubt to choose clinical programs, I would say that would be the best decision you can make in law school. Going and working in the clinic, any clinic, especially immigration.
Well, thank you, Sadra. Again, I did not pay him to say that, so thank you for your wonderful comments. So now I'm just going to go ahead and offer a little bit of my perspective. So as I mentioned previously, I was a student attorney in the clinic, and I did work with Eric specifically on the green card portion of his case. So like Eric mentioned, first he asked for asylum, and then he was before an immigration judge. and the immigration judge had granted him asylum, but unfortunately, the trial attorney who represents ICE, represents the government, decided to reserve appeal on the case. So the immigration clinic, before I got there, worked with Eric to go through the appeal process. Ultimately, it got sent back to the immigration court. And finally, years later, as Eric explained, the grant of asylum was final. So for folks who are seeking asylum in the United States, once they get asylum, a year later, they're eligible to apply for their green card. And so that's when I came and met Eric, when he was about to get to his year of having asylum here in the United States. And so he was seeking our help once again to help him get a green card. Think about this as sort of different stages in the path to citizenship. First is asylum. It's an immigration status in the United States that affords folks protection, the ability to stay here. It also affords folks other benefits, such as the ability to work in the United States. The next step is a green card, which comes with even more benefits. Again, the ability to work. And 4 years after that, when you're going through the asylum process and you're an asylee, 4 years after having your green card, you're eligible to become a citizen, which affords you all the rights and privileges, right, that U.S. citizens have. So the green card stage where I helped Eric was sort of like the second step in that process towards citizenship. And so for me as a student, it was really an opportunity to sort of learn the nitty-gritty of putting together an application for immigration purposes. In law school classrooms, we talk a lot about the law in sort of a very hypothetical, esoteric kind of manner. But this was really like the first time I got to see the law like being applied to someone, that very much wanted that benefit, that had their own experiences already, having been years in the immigration process. And so for me, that was just very eye-opening. Everything from like how the filing has to be put together, right? It has to be presented a certain way, it has to be tabbed, has to have a cover letter. These are sort of the tangible things that you don't learn in a law school classroom. And so again, that was really the first time for me to like go through that experience with a real life client. I learned, right, that immigration applications, they often have a reputation of just being filling out forms, but it's actually a lot more than that. The government asks for a lot of evidence and a lot of explanations for things. And so for Eric's case in particular, right, I had to ask you for like birth certificates. I had to ask you like, I don't even know how many questions at this were, like 50 yes or no questions, like, have you ever been a Nazi? Like, these are real questions that are on the green card application, right? And so we went through it together, and for certain questions that Eric might have had to answer yes, like for example, he had been in immigration proceedings, I then had to do like a supplement to explain that, right? He had been granted asylum, then it was appealed, and then he'd been granted asylum. So all of that required me first to figure out like what are the necessary components of this application under the guidance of Professor Benitez, but also under the guidance really of the clinic community generally, because we have a saying in the immigration clinic, we do not like to reinvent the wheel. And so I had plenty of samples, right, to work off as well from prior student attorneys, so I wasn't completely in the dark in this process. But then it required me to go back to Eric and ask you all these pretty personal questions, right, about your life, and again, get those dates down, all the details and names of things that happened, and then, like I said, learn how to put it together in a packet that ultimately a USCIS officer was gonna review. And so with green card applications for people that have asylum, typically there's not an interview component. They can be granted just on the application alone. So really I had to make sure that there was sufficient evidence in there that an officer from USCIS could review it and say, you know what, this is a grant. I'm gonna go ahead and get him his green card. And that's ultimately what happened. You were able to get your green card. And so then I sort of shifted roles when it came to your citizenship application. So I was a supervisor at that point when 4 years later, Eric was eligible to apply for his citizenship. And we sort of went through the same thing, but this time I was working with the student, Alex, and it was a different role because now I had to guide Alex to do the exact same things that I had done as a student attorney, right? To figure out what is the supporting documents that are needed. What are the explanations that we have to give on the application? Making sure that she was regularly meeting with Eric to ask you questions and get the information, and then reviewing. So this time, instead of having my stuff review, right, I was the reviewer. So Professor Benitez and I are very hands-on in the immigration clinic, and there's many drafts. And so I see some former students in the audience, they can attest to this. There's many drafts that these applications go through before they are finalized and sent to the agency, in this case, USCIS. Like Eric said, unfortunately, there was a tremendous wait, even longer than when he applied for his green card, for him to get citizenship. And that's because we applied right when the pandemic started, a month before the pandemic started. And so USCIS experienced tremendous delays throughout we're still in the pandemic, but especially the first couple of years of the pandemic. Actually, at one point, they straight up said, we're not processing green card or citizenship applications. And so that created a huge backlog that we're still experiencing to this day. And so like Eric said, it took years, even after his interview, because eventually Eric did have, we applied before the pandemic, but you had your interview a month before the pandemic started. Right. That's what it was. Even though Eric had his interview, we had to wait years for a decision. And that involved a lot of students, myself, contacting USCIS and saying, hey, what's going on here? We want a decision on Eric's case. But unfortunately, with the immigration agencies, a lot of times the follow-up just kind of goes into a black hole. Either you don't get a response, you don't really get a meaningful response. The response might be, it's processing, but no sort of indication where the person is in the process. Sometimes you get a notice saying, we're missing this evidence. It needs to be submitted before a final decision can be made. But we weren't even getting that in Eric's case. So we were just really stuck at that point. So eventually, apparently, I annoyed the government enough that we got good news that Eric's application was approved. And like I said, we were able to go actually to Baltimore, to the USCIS field office there for his swearing in. Because COVID procedures were still in place, like I said, I was not allowed in the building, but I was there to take many pictures of you with your American flag after to celebrate. And so for me, really, it was kind of a full circle moment, right? I started with Eric as a student, learned a lot from working with you, took those lessons to then be a supervisor, to supervise students like Alex, who helped you, and Sadra, who helped you with a different part of your process, which is trying to get your wife's green card. And so, it was just a really proud moment seeing you finally, get sworn in after all the years of wondering what's going on, trying to get an answer and figure it out. And so, now it's great, right? Because Eric is a U.S. citizen, he now has the ability to petition for his wife, who is currently undocumented. And so I just learned good news about the family, but they have two little ones who were born here in the United States. And so it's another way to help, right? That's why the unofficial saying of the immigration clinic is reuniting families and saving lives, because now we're working to make sure that his wife gets to stay here with Eric and with their children as well. And so for me, I guess all of those experiences are why I continue to be with the clinic, why I came back to the clinic in the first place, and why I really advocate for clinical education, because it was very impactful in my career. So I guess before we open it up to questions, or maybe ask some questions that you may have, I do just want to give some advice, much in the same vein that Eric and Sadra did, for immigrants and for students who are thinking about going into a clinical program. So for immigrants generally, yes, I echo everything that was said, which is patience. I think the reoccurring theme is, unfortunately, there are just tremendous backlogs in every part of the immigration system. In the immigration court specifically, there's over 1.5 million cases pending nationwide. In our court in particular, in the Arlington Immigration Court, the furthest hearing we have out is in 2024. We have one client who has been waiting since 2013 to have her hearing. It's been postponed at least 4 times. So as was previously stated, right, these folks that are going through the process, are in limbo, really, because they don't really know what's going on with their case. They have sort of over their head the idea of, can I stay in the United States, or am I going to have to go back eventually? What does that look like? And while all of this is pending, people's lives continue. People get married, people have kids, right? And then their kids are US citizens, they have mixed status families, they have jobs, they go to school, all these things, right? And so it's always sort of a constant worry in the back of their mind, like, am I going to have to uproot from all of this life that I established here in the United States to then have to go back to my country? And so for people that are going through the process, yes, patience. Unfortunately, that this is the way that the system operates. Like I said, there's follow-up attempts that can be made, but unfortunately, just our system is not great about being responsive. I'm actually currently writing a law review article about that very topic. And so patience is key. And that's easier said than done, right? I was born here, so I was able to be a US citizen. I have not gone through this process. And so, I can only empathize and on behalf of my clients, like, try to get information, try to follow up, reassure them that everything is going okay in their case. But again, yes, patience is necessary. The other thing is, a lot of these applications and benefits require a tremendous level of detail. So I talked right about having to give these explanations for Eric's application. So to the extent that's possible, immigrants going through the process should be prepared to be very detail-oriented. They should be prepared to remember dates and names and places, guard all the documentation that you ever got from immigration, any of the agencies, any immigration official, evidence of your case to the extent that was possible to bring from your home country or request from your home country. All of those things are going to be very important, especially, right, if you're working with a program like ours. Your representative, say Sadra, for example, they're going to ask you for that. And so again, it's very good to remember to be patient, not only patient, but also very detail-oriented throughout this process. My advice for students is also similar, and that be detail-oriented. I think a successful student attorney in any clinical program, not just immigration law, is going to be focusing on those details, right? We often say to our students, think like a trial attorney, right? How is someone going to poke holes in this case? Think like a USCIS officer. Think like an immigration judge, right? You need to be thinking about those details, because at the end of the day, someone's going to ask those questions. It needs to start with you as a representative. And likewise, patience, right? This may be your first time working with real people, and people come with all sorts of personalities, all sorts of things that they are working through. They may have experienced trauma, right? They may be late to meetings, they may forget things. And so really, patience is also required of student attorneys as well, as you learn how to work with real people, with all the wonderful things that come with them and all the complexities, right, that come with working with real individuals. So I'll end on that note. And then, I don't know, what do you think? Should we open it up to audience? Okay.
And did anybody have questions? First, thank you all for sharing.
Yeah,
This
of
is
course.
incredible. Did anybody have any initial reactions or questions that you wanted to ask our panel? Yes. We have a mic coming to you.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Andrea, for organizing this. I want to point out Alexa McDonald.
Okay, I thought that was you, but I was like, I can't tell with the mask. I thought you were going to be on Zoom. Yeah.
Who is,
I took a night off.
Nice.
who is now Alexa Glock,
Yeah.
who was the student attorney in 2010 who represented Eric at the asylum at the immigration court proceeding where he was first granted asylum. So welcome, Alexa, and thank you for all the great work that you did.
Profe, that wasn't a question.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I have two questions. The first one is about the clinic. If the clinic is taking employment-based immigration cases or not, and and why? And the other is about more about the political context, no? For Eric, since you have a process who deal with different administrations, those changes in the administrations change your perspective about the process. You feel hopeless or more hope in different situations. How do you feel with those different administrations? No, thank you.
I'll let you answer first if you want. So the question was because your case went through different administrations, right? Did you notice any sort of change when there was a change in administration and the way that your case was handled?
Honestly, I didn't notice any change. The case lasted like 6 years, so I don't think there was a change based on the administration. No.
I guess from a attorney perspective, there are definitely changes throughout administrations. So I talked like one that comes to mind just because I talked about follow-up. Like for example, in like the last administration, like you couldn't follow up with this one part of the agency called the ombudsman's office. Like that wasn't even a thing, and now that's a thing again. And so they're in some ways a little bit more. This administration's a little bit more customer service oriented. But I echo what Eric says, right? No matter what administration there is, there's always been sort of tremendous delays in the processing of applications, whether it's at the immigration court or USCIS. I do think the pandemic added to that tremendously, but even in this administration, for example, the thing I'm experiencing now is all of my clients are applying for work permits, and what used to take a month to process is now like taking over a year in some cases. And so that's a problem that I think needs to be fixed structurally, that just hasn't been fixed yet. Regarding your question about employment-based, no, at this time the Immigration Clinic does not handle employment-based immigration cases. There's a couple reasons for that. First and foremost, that's just not me and Professor Benita's area of expertise. We come from a more humanitarian background, although we commend, certainly, we have alums that do work in that context, and that is, I've learned very interesting things. We actually had an alum from 2020 speak recently to our clinic students about how at her firm they sometimes handle cases of like celebrities that are trying to get certain like status via like their achievements, and that's like in the employment-based context. So it's definitely interesting work, but those folks also tend to have more resources to be able to find representation. Not always, certainly, but we do also try to help folks, right, that maybe otherwise can't afford representation, because again, we're able to offer it on pro bono basis. But as you can imagine, right, the demand is much greater than what we're able to offer, or really any nonprofit clinical program in the area is able to offer. And so for that reason, we just decided to focus a little bit more and not work on those types of cases. Does that answer your questions? Great, thank you.
Thank you, fantastic panel, great discussion. I did have a question kind of piggybacking on the administration differences. That was actually one of the questions I wanted to ask directly, but since that was already kind of answered, I guess over the decades, how has the process changed for immigration? Obviously it's been in the news, it's always a political topic nowadays. But just over the decades, immigration was obviously big in the 1900s, and it's kind of evolved since. So just feedback on that. Yeah.
Sure. Do any of you want to respond? I have some thoughts, but
Go ahead, thank you.
No?
no.
Okay. That's a no? Okay. So I can respond. I think in a lot of ways immigration has changed over the decades, and a lot of ways things have stayed the same. I think, history is kind of cyclical, and I think we see throughout history, right, the exclusion of a lot of different groups, and maybe being more welcoming of other types of groups, right? The very first federal immigration law that is on the books is the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So from day one, that sort of set the tone for the intersection of race in immigration law. And so, again, like I said, there's been historically groups that have been excluded. Right now, we work a lot with Central American clients who are fleeing gang violence, primarily from the Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. But there's been a number of different policies that were particularly enacted under the last administration that makes it much more difficult, almost impossible in some cases, for folks trying to come in from the southern border to then come into the United States to pursue asylum. And some of the things that our clients have faced, that many of these folks have faced, are like either they're being recruited to be in the gangs. For example, they target a lot of teenage boys, or like we have a lot of teenage female identifying clients who were targeted to be gang girlfriends. We've had a lot of cases that we've been able to win on that basis. Or like parents, right, that are trying to prevent their children from either being recruited into the gangs or become gang girlfriends. So those are some of the scenarios that we see, and like I said, many folks are still experiencing that. But then, right, we recently, obviously what's happening in Ukraine is horrible, and my heart goes out to all of those folks. But we're seeing, right, the application of some of those rules that are being applied to keep Central Americans, in Mexico in particular, not allowed to come in the United States, were not being applied to Ukrainians who were then allowed to come into the United States. So like I said, I feel like history is very cyclical, right? And that like there's always certain groups that we are trying to sort of keep out of the United States, and other groups that are just sort of more welcoming. And so in many ways that's changed. And I think that is regardless of what political party is in office. Certainly in the last administration, I have like PTSD because honestly, every day the law was changing at that point, and I was getting frantic calls from clients being like, what does this mean for my case? And I was like, I don't even know what this means. So it was constantly trying to figure out what the changes are. Now the pace has slowed a lot more in that regard, but like I said, there's still things like the policy that I was talking about is Title 42. It's a public health policy that on its face was supposed to prevent the spread of COVID into the United States, but is being used to keep asylum seekers out, while other folks who go back and forth between the border are not subject to that. And like I said, Ukrainians have not been subject to that. The Biden administration has finally decided they're going to end it altogether, although there have been legal court challenges to that too. But it's like, why are we in 2022 and Title 42 is just ending, when public health officials have been saying for years that actually it wasn't necessary to stop the spread of COVID? So it's like each administration still has their thing, right? It's sometimes better, sometimes worse, but never really exactly where we need it to be, right? So does that answer your question?
It does, and you kind of brought up a second. Yeah, no, you did certainly answer it, and I had another thought as you were answering it. So those demographic differences that these immigrants are coming from, does that, bring about quotas from the government in terms of the number that they'll pass through then? Is that such a thing, and does that cause additional issues?
Sure. So there are quotas for some immigration benefits, but not for all. So for example, someone like Eric, who was applying for the asylum benefit within the, that process is done within the United States. So folks who are within the United States asking for protection to not be sent back to their country because they fear some persecution, either that happened to them in the past and or that will happen to them again in the future. There's no quota on the number of people that can be granted asylum. Whereas someone who's a refugee, it's a similar situation in that they're fearful of going back to their country for some reason. But the executive branch does set quotas for refugees. And that process is done from outside of the United States. So the number of people that can come in refugee status is capped, again, depending on the executive. And again, in the last administration, the number went down to what, like 10,000 or something, like absurd. Now it's back to over 100,000. So that is capped. But again, asylum, so within the United States, that's not capped. There are also other country caps for like some family-based categories, depending on countries that have been, I guess, historically overprescribed: China, the Philippines, Mexico. So some countries, do experiencing that too. It really just depends what avenue you're going through, and that's where we see the quotas.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
I keep going. All right, might as well. So I do have one more related to Eric's case. All right, thank you. Just last question, I promise. So you had mentioned going through Eric's case that ICE petitioned And so is that normal? And why would they petition? And, you know, obviously that elongates the process even further. So is that normal?
Sure. So actually, specifically, what ICE did is they reserved appeal, and then they actually appealed. Yeah, they appealed the case. That happens. So it really, and that's the frustrating part about immigration. There's so many variables, and that's why I think Eric said it like a lottery system. Like it really depends on like who your judge is, who your trial attorney is. I'd worked with trial attorneys who are lovely. They've actually reviewed the materials. They come in. They're willing to stipulate to things. Some don't even oppose a grant of asylum. They're like, yeah, this person merits asylum. I'm not going to fight it. And then you have the complete opposite extreme. And so I've dealt with trial attorneys who like, I just remember because it was so dramatic. This trial attorney, it was for a domestic violence survivor from Central America. And honestly, at the end, the judge said it was the most evidence she's ever seen in that type of case. But the trial attorney was adamant about fighting it, which the kicker was, it was on International Women's Day. But she picked up my filing and she goes, Your Honor, everything. Like that's how she said. She wanted to question on everything. And so again, you really see the spectrum for trial attorneys. And so some trial attorneys are going to fight harder to deport people. They are the moving party. ICE is who places people into removal proceedings. And so for some reason, they've identified that they feel this person should not stay in the United States. Like I said, some will review and be like, yeah, the person meets all the elements for this form of relief. We're not going to fight it. But some, and I guess in Eric's case, decided, no, we don't feel that the elements of asylum were met, and we are going to fight this at the appellate court. Appellate court sent it back, and the judge, with instructions, I believe, right, to ultimately to consider the evidence in a different way, and then to grant, and then ultimately the immigration judge did that, right? But yeah, it really is a spectrum, and the same thing with judges too. Like some judges are more amenable, some. Honestly, I feel have made up their mind before they even stepped into the courtroom and heard the testimony. So it really is a lottery system. Yeah. Profe?
Can we ask Alexa to tell us about her day in court with Eric?
Yeah. Alexa, pull up a seat. You're on the panel now.
Yeah, that was, he was not lying when he said she was mean. And that was the experience, just the type of person that's just going to go after every little detail and who won't even let you know if they are going to appeal when you call them as a polite. One of the things that we learned in immigration clinic was call your opponent afterwards and say, are you, planning to file the appeal? Have you filed an appeal? And in this particular case, she was like, I don't know yet. I don't know. I just don't know. And wouldn't tell me. So we were kind of in limbo until we got the paperwork. Usually they will give you that courtesy of saying, yes, I'm planning to appeal. But yeah, it was a very, very long day, multiple hour day. We took a 30-minute break. My now husband had been waiting, thought I was going to be done at a certain time of day and was like, where are you? And we're like, still in court. But it was a lot of preparation in clinic. We went through, like Eric said, the, kind of like moot court rehearsal. One of the other student attorneys was playing the role of the ICE attorney. But yeah, it was a long, long day, but one of those decisions too that was an oral decision as opposed to a written decision. So we knew that day at the end of it all, the judge came out and said his opinion, but it was also a roller coaster opinion where he started off saying all the things that he thought was wrong and this was good and he was not going to consider that. And then at the very end, he's like, but I'll grant asylum. So yeah, it was one of the most fulfilling experiences of my life, I will say. I have 2 kids, so besides that, I don't want them to feel I've shut them out. But yeah, it was really great, and I look back on it fondly and can't ever thank Professor Benitez enough for the opportunity.
Excellent. I want to check in to see if we have any questions on Zoom. No? Okay. And any others here? Looks like we have one.
Great panel. I would ask, where do you get your cases from?
Sure. So lots of different places is the answer. We do have an intake process, typically during the academic semester. So just a little bit of context about the way the immigration clinic works. We typically have 8 to 9 law students that we supervise in the academic semester. Then we also have paid law student interns during the summer as well. We typically don't open our intake in the summer, sort of depends on the group of interns, but we try to do so in the academic semester. And so after a couple of weeks of, getting the students situated, make sure that they're on track with the accepted clients, we'll ask the front desk to sort of field calls. Again, we don't take like employment-based immigration cases, so those folks will just get referred from the outset. But people can call the immigration or the clinic number generally. They would now speak with Cameron, who is our lovely receptionist, and she would take down their basic information. That information would then get passed along to a student attorney, who then calls back to do a little bit more of an in-depth phone call. And then they bring it to myself and Professor Benitez. We have a discussion and we're like, yeah, this is an asylum case, it's an immigration court, okay, check, 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 these are all the things that we do. Let's bring them in for a more in-depth interview. And so then the student attorney is responsible for bringing them in, they'll meet with them for a couple of hours, then they write a memo to file about all the facts that they gathered, as well as their analysis of the law. Is there an argument to be made? What are the complications in the case, right? And then ultimately their recommendation. Then we sit down, myself, Professor Benitez, the student attorney, and we decide, okay, actually you need to ask these follow-up questions, or this is a taker, or like, let's go ahead and refer this out. So those folks, the way that they call and find out about us, one, we're on a list, we're actually on multiple lists through the immigration court. So we're on the list for the Arlington Immigration Court pro bono legal service provider. The Hyattsville Immigration Court just opened a few months ago, and upon information and belief, we are on that list as well. So that's one way. We're also on some other legal service pro bono provider lists. Periodically, I get asked, is this information correct? I'm like, yes. And then really the other one is through word of mouth, right? Because the clinic's been going on for so long that we get calls, oh, you helped my cousin, you helped so-and-so. Or like current clients would be like, hey, my uncle just came here, would you be able to talk to them? And so we'll connect through that. And then sometimes I also get referrals either from our alums, other nonprofits, or other clinical programs in the DC area. So those are some of the ways that people find us. But actually, I'm really curious, Eric, how did you find us?
That was through the list I was giving at the immigration, so, yeah.
See, there you go. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Great. Other questions?
I do have one question. I'd love to hear from each of you all, because you all each have a very valuable perspective in this, for both the asylum process as well as the green card process. Is there, I know this is a loaded question, but is there any, maybe 1 or 2 recommendations you would have for improving the process, if we could?
I would just say something about improving or changing the whole immigration process in the U.S. In general, that's my personal opinion. Because I believe the U.S. should try to have like a selective immigration, because I came here as what they call a skillful immigrant. Back in my country, in Cameroon, I was an accountant, I was an auditor, so I have a good career. But it took me years to get back to an accounting job here in the U.S. because of immigration status. So if they had some criteria saying, if you want to come to the U.S., these are the criteria you should meet, then I believe I should have been able to land a job, get a permanent residency quicker, and move on with my life.
Sadra, do you have any thoughts?
I would say if you make the process more kind of digitalized, maybe you can do it with internet. Because I know that in Canada, most of the immigration cases are being done through the internet application, online applications. For example, if you have online applications for asylum, I think that would be much easier to process. The documents probably would not be missing, and the process would be much more faster, I think, much faster. Yeah.
Yeah, I chuckled a little bit because technology is not the strong suit of our immigration agencies. In fact, we are one of the only court systems in the United States that just got online filing for cases. And I regularly see on immigration attorney forums all the issues that there still are, even though we have ability now to file online for certain cases. So, yeah, that would be nice, Sandra. That's a great idea. Man, I have many thoughts on this, so I feel like people are probably overhearing me talk. Man, what can we do? I just think that there needs to be a lot more transparency in the process. Like I said, it's like really impossible to follow up. I think that there should maybe even be like sort of like time limits, like you have to, well, I feel like that could cut for or against, but like there should just be like, they shouldn't be allowed to just like sit on a decision for years and years and years and years, right? Because like I said, that puts people's like livelihood in limbo. I think that there's this idea, and sometimes administrations that are anti-immigrant try to paint asylum as if it's like this really easy process, like anyone can just come to the United States and they can just get asylum. Really, that's not the case. There's like so many elements now, both based in the statute, but also just via case law that have been added and that you have to meet for asylum. And I think it makes it like pretty near impossible for people to represent themselves like pro se. I mean, it's hard for me. I'm been a practicing attorney for so many years, and sometimes I'm like, what does this mean? Like, what does this case mean? And you're sort of at the whims of like what circuit you're sitting in, right? Because we're in the Fourth Circuit, and sometimes they say good things about immigration, sometimes they say not good things about immigration. The Fifth Circuit, where Texas is, right, will say lots of bad things about immigration. And so again, you're sort of at the whims of the court when it comes to that. So I just feel like the process is just unnecessarily convoluted, and it should be simpler, right? Because actually our asylum obligations come from international treaty that was adopted into domestic law, and sometimes I feel like the way that this country fights so hard not to give people asylum contradicts our international law obligations, right? And that we adopted into domestic law. So I just feel like there's lots of people that would be eligible for asylum, but for all these complications, ultimately don't get asylum. And I mean, you hear cases of people being deported back to their country, and what they said was going to happen to them happens. They get harmed or killed, or because they weren't able to get that protection here in the United States. And again, I think that just really runs afoul of who we should want to be as a country, right? Which is offering protection to folks like this.
All great ideas. And yeah, we probably have time for about one more question if anybody has one. There in the back.
Hey, thanks so much for the panel. It's been really interesting. Just curious, do you have a sense in terms of the countries where people tend to want to immigrate, Europe or Asia or wherever, or the United States? Is there one country you could single out that has, like, relatively speaking, the best system or the most ideal system? Or maybe it's this country, but take it whichever way you want to take that. Thanks.
I mean, I guess, yeah, a lot of people look at Canada, right, and some of the ways that like Sadra outlined, right, that their system works better. But it's just interesting because in recent history, you've seen like in Europe, Australia, for example, a lot of countries also have sort of seen this uptick in anti-immigrant sentiment. And so like that's also reflected in their asylum system as well. So like thinking about like the Syrians, like, going into Europe, and, actually African immigrants going up into Europe, how they're treated. But now we have Ukrainians, right, who are being displaced as well. So, we'll see how that works for them in other European countries. I would probably not classify the United States as the best asylum system for many of the reasons we talked about today, and for many others that we don't have time to talk about. But another biggie that we don't particularly work on the immigration clinic, we don't work on detained cases, we only do non-detained cases. But like, for example, we have I think some of the highest numbers of detention of asylum seekers. And so there's a question about like people who are fleeing trauma, like then further being traumatized by being placed in detention. And why are we treating them like they broke the law or did something bad, when again, really, they're just trying to come here for safety purposes. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we can stand to do better. Maybe looking at the example of Canada, or maybe even looking at the European countries and some of the things that we don't like and saying, is that how we want to be, you know, and re-examining our policies through that lens. So that's my answer to your question. You're welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you all again. This has been such a fantastic panel. I have a couple other announcements just to let you all know. This is an ongoing series, so our next one will focus on family justice and access to justice.